Everyone, thanks for joining me tonight for our latest installment of the Evelyn Barbour Lecture Series. This year lectures entitled Blackface on White Power. I am here tonight inside the gallery of our latest exhibition, Picture Me As I Am, and sitting in front of this amazing map, and it's our way of making sure that you all get some sense of this exhibition. Right behind me is on this side, I don't know, whatever, is the board entitled Black Progressives. And I think in terms of thinking about the Evelyn Barbour lectures and thinking about what we're going to talk about tonight, it's an apropos space to be in. But first, let me start out by telling you about the Evelyn Barbour Lecture Series. We began this series now Um, I would say we've been doing this for a couple years, since 2014, certainly. Um, Named after our beloved Evelyn Barbour, who um, would say things to me like, Andrea, don't worry, it'll all happen in its time. And I really appreciate now even more that little bit of advice. But Evelyn was someone who I first met as part of our advisory committee. She was one of the first members of our advisory committee here at the African American Heritage Center. And she passed in 2014 at the age of 78 after a short illness. She attended the Jefferson School and was among the first graduating class of Jackson P. Burley High School. She's an alumnus of Virginia Union University and the University of Virginia School of Education. She taught in various school systems and retired after more than 30 years of service. She's a lifelong member of Mount Zion First African Baptist Church, and her most notable work in the church was her role as her historian. And I would say that is the thing that identified her the most, her love for this community, this love for this community's history, and certainly is what drives us in the work that we do today. We began the series, as I said, in 2014, and in 2023, today, we're tackling a subject that is a consequence of a push for organizations to create culture and environments that promote safety for everyone. It began as a good thing and has been co-opted, some would argue, and transformed by the systems that were created long ago in opposition to this goal. This year, we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some call it JEDI because they've added on justice to the title as well. How it's changed since its inception and how it's changed for the better. Tonight, we've got Dr. Avina Ross with us tonight. And again, I really enjoy these conversations because I learn so much. And Dr. Ross, she's a cisgender Black feminist woman, sister, advocate, and mother to 6-year-old Langston Rise. Great name, by the way. She's worked in the domestic and sexual violence field for 15 plus years with nonprofits, state and local government, and in higher education. Currently, Dr. Ross works for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and provides consultation services to entities seeking to elevate diversity, equity, inclusion, and well-being. Ooh, a new acronym, well-being, into their organizational practices, policies, and services in support of survivors and staff. She's a former employee of the Virginia Department of Social Services, Office of Family Violence, and Princeton University, where she elevated DEIW into violence prevention awareness programs, advocacy services, and service program evaluation. And it was her time at Princeton where I became aware of her work. She received her PhD in 2016 in social work from Virginia Commonwealth University, and she's also earned her master's degree in sociology from VCU and bachelor's in sociology and women's studies from the College of William and Mary. So, Dr. Ross, may I call you Avina for the peoples?
Call me Avina for the people.
All right, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
So we're virtual, but we also have a few people here with us in the audience. So you're talking to me, but you're talking to the peoples as well. Okay. So let's jump right into it, because I always want to start with this question about definitions. So for you, what is DEI? What does that actually mean in terms of your practice and your understanding of that space?
Absolutely. I mean, simply put, it's really about, the practices, the work, the mindset, and the intention of, ending oppression in whatever institution, whatever spaces in your personal life. And that's my approach to DEI. It's a very holistic type of approach. And I add in the W, I add in the well-being, because it's been my experience that in doing that work, the well-being of the people who are doing that work tends to take a huge backseat. Um, and that's unfortunate, and it causes more harm. And so that's just in a very simple, not non-dissertation kind of way of describing what I feel DEI is, for sure.
Well, I'm intrigued by that because I think, in the spaces that we occupy, this notion of well-being has come up a lot. We talk to young activists, we talk to people who are engaged in social justice work, and they talk a lot about burnout, and they talk a lot about how much the work takes from them both in their personal life, as you said, but personally.
Mhm.
And it's interesting to me that, I said something about justice as another sort of moniker that has recently come, because I don't believe, in my experience at least, that's where we started. But this is this is part of the journey. And so you're adding yet another piece of that journey. And I want to just dig into that just a little bit. Talk a little bit more about this notion of well-being, because I keep rambling, but DEI seems to be about institution more than it seems to be about people necessarily.
Well, I look at it from a macro and micro lens,
Okay.
right? So it is about, institutions for sure, their practices, their policies, the ways in which they cause harm, and the ways in which we're trying to mitigate, prevent that harm in the future. But it's also about the day to day, the lived experience, right? And if you have human beings who are doing that work day in and day out, hearing about trauma, hearing about oppression, microaggressions, all of these kinds of things, it certainly takes an impact. And those people, myself included, have experienced those very same things we were seeking to combat and prevent. In my case, on behalf of students within higher education. So the well-being part is important. We want diversity, we want equity and inclusion for all of the sort of social justice related reasons, but also for the mental and the physical health of those people as well.
Mhm.
And that's where well-being becomes really an important component of DEI for me.
That's interesting. Thank you for expounding on that. So, working in this space, when you're in that space, let's pretend you're at the job hire, right? And you're sitting in there and they're like, yes, we want you to come on board. We want you to impact organizational change. What are they normally communicating to you as their goal or their aspiration concerning DEI? What are you
Good
hearing
question.
from institutions?
Two things come up for me when I think about what institutions, organizations often communicate to potential new hires or candidates. We hear a lot about representation, right? We want to have people who look like and have similar experiences with the people we're trying to serve or increase accessibility for, right? So I feel like on a very easy level, institutions and organizations are at this point now owning up that representation matters, right? The other piece that I have often heard, if not explicitly, is this idea of increasing accessibility and wanting to provide, you know, um, culturally relevant or culturally competent services. Um, and so that those tend to be the phrases, the words, the expressions of hiring managers, those in human resources, and those who are doing the direct work, who would ultimately be the supervisors of the people who come on board. Um, but very rarely do you hear we are working to create a healthy working space for people who do this critical work. And we want this work to be led by the people who have lived and professional experience in the field. I don't often hear that. And I think part of that is that it tends to come from people who carry a lot of privilege.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, not all the time, but they carry a lot of privilege, be it their racial identity, their financial makeup, whether they're, you know, products or people who are, um, legacy students and staff of institutions who just have a long history of having family just rooted there. Um, but those tend to be the monikers that we hear in the field in terms of social work, in terms of my background with domestic sexual violence, and definitely within higher education.
So, looking at your CV, you've worked for institutions with the capital I institution,
Yes.
right?
Hmm.
And so, in particular, the way that you came to my attention is because I was looking at Twitter one day and saw um, a post about Princeton and the fact that they had the three DEI people and there had just quit.
Sure.
Um, so I wanted to sort of dig into that a little bit because we've set up a set of uh, ideals that are expressed by an institution based on what they tell you in that early meeting. But what is the reality like, right? When you get in there, are you really able to execute the thing that which they claimed that they said that they wanted?
That's a really complex question. I think it's more nuanced than just a yes and a no, right? I think, you know, Black and Brown folks, we have had a very long history of working, under the radar in a very grassroots way, of trying to make incremental or even, more substantial changes within institutions. And I find that has been, my lived experience at Princeton and at other institutions that, you find your people. You find your people who can elevate certain things for you in certain spaces that you're not a part of, that you're not invited to. You find your allies, right? Um, in terms of, um, the no, you know, it um, it becomes really cumbersome and a lot to sort of take on initially because you've got to learn this very new institution, right? Princeton, for example, was new to me. New Jersey was relatively new to me. And Princeton's a very long standing institution in this country. And institutions by design are not built for change, they are built to sustain their initial, you know, um, values and missions. And so change is slow, right? That's something that you hear at Princeton a lot is change is very, very slow, and you've got to learn how to be okay with that. And so that's the kind of web that you have to sort of learn to navigate. You've got to learn who are truly your allies and your people who get it and want substantive change and want to really improve the well-being and the lives of the students on campus, um, and help prepare them for, you know, elevating social change when they leave.
Mhm.
Um, and then you have to figure out who are the folks that are not really there for change, that are, just agents to maintain status quo. And so it takes a long time to sort of figure that out. But ultimately, in my experience, I found my people. It was a small, very cohort of us, and most of us have left.
Right.
Hmm.
And that is kind of the question. Most of you have left, right? And when I looked at the article, both many of you were saying we were not set up to succeed,
No.
right? So where is the disconnect between the promise and the truth of that in your experience?
Well, one, the folks who were hired to improve, the well-being, the lives of students on campus, to bring about change, were not necessarily people with a lot of power and decision-making power. Um, that you had to appeal to the powers that be, and oftentimes things could be shut down. And I'm not talking about bringing, a keynote on campus, like that small time, right? But making substantive change to a policy or creating new policy, right? That was slower. Um, and so the disconnect, I think, sometimes has to do with, at least at Princeton, there were there are leaders there that have been there for a very long time, and their identities play a part. I personally experienced working with people who definitely were dealing with white fragility, right? That's very real and alive. And um, there were times where leaders would express discomfort and made decisions based upon their comfort level and not on what was best and most needed for the students, let alone for the staff. So the disconnect was grand, right? In my office, we wanted to set up mechanisms to prevent interpersonal violence on campus, to equip students with, strategies for making informed decisions in their intimate and personal relationships that were healthy, right? But at the same time, you add in aspects of um, directions. For example, I wanted to go with curriculum development um, that I had to do in a very incremental way because it made some people uncomfortable. So those are the kinds of things that DEI practitioners really have to grapple with in the day to day, and it becomes overwhelming. I can't tell you the number of times me personally or colleagues have been um, in community with each other in tears, frustrated about the barriers that we were up against, and the stories, right, that we heard from the students in terms of their own harm on campus.
So, in some instances, and correct me if I'm wrong, because, in some instances, you've got a DI program that's hiring Black bodies
Mhm.
that stand in the way as if they're like all of a sudden receive superhuman power, right? You've got this great big DEI on your chest and you're there with your lightning bolt. That's what I see in my brain when I'm thinking about the DEI person, that their work is supposed to be of this sort of colossal superhuman capacity.
Yes.
And what I've heard you say is you're battling entrenchment, you're battling identity, you're battling tradition and culture. And then this weird thing that I find almost impossible to understand, discomfort,
Yes.
right? And discomfort never is a positive thing ever
Mhm.
in this conversation. And so I guess the question I'm asking about is, how do you, as someone with all of the best intentions, moving into this space, you ultimately decided this wasn't going to work for you. But what would it have taken from you, going back to this wellness thing, for you to have remained in that space?
Oh, that's a great question. I think having leadership take accountability for being complicit in harming staff and students, period. That's definitely one, concrete, practical thing. Um, but for me, that never happened. Um, for me to sort of see that overall, the campus's approach to student well-being was elevated beyond surface level conversations.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, the university would make it seem like the students were the only ones that needed to learn something. And that couldn't have been further from the truth, right? I definitely dealt with leadership silencing, right? One of the catalysts for me in leaving was that I had leadership um, say that my office um, could not openly publish an annual report that we wrote to and for the students. The staff were incredibly vulnerable. It was not a typical, annual report that was designed for a board or for donations. It was for the students. And we were told no. And so when you're dealing with that kind of a dynamic, um, it becomes really difficult to see, for me personally, me staying longer.
Mhm.
That was essentially a huge turning point for me um, at Princeton,
Mhm.
as it was for some of my other colleagues.
Mhm. So you've left Princeton,
Hmm.
and you're in your new institution, right?
That I can't talk too much about as a federal employee, but
Which
yes.
we won't,
Okay.
because the question isn't about the institution. It is about you and the lessons that you learn and that you bring to it. Because,
Sure.
I would imagine that there's a whole lot of frustration within this space. This kind of knowing that the work that you're doing is necessary, knowing that as we've all, at least here in Charlottesville, we've been in this equity conversation in earnest now for 6 years. And I personally feel that there is a retrenchment occurring and a needing to get along at the heart of it. This deep need for us to get along and the unwillingness to continue to roll around in this space, right? So it feels to me what's important is that for every person who has left a job because of something, that they add some more stuff into the tool bag for people like us who are still in it and thinking, man, this work is just more than I can take. Tomorrow, I'm not sure I'm coming to work tomorrow, because it's Wednesday and hump day is not hump day enough. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because I'm dealing with something else on hump day. So what I'm interested in is when you leave Princeton, if you understand that space, that you weren't going to be successful in that space, you haven't left the profession, you're still in the profession. So what's in your tool bag now?
Well, I kind of want to just reframe a little bit. I feel like I was incredibly successful at Princeton.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, no,
I didn't mean to say you, but
I definitely, in terms of how I measure success, I was able to support a number of students with marginalized identities. I was able to mentor them. I was able to mentor some colleagues. I was able to find colleagues that I felt were super brilliant that made me smarter. Those are some measures of success for me, for sure.
Right.
I definitely made changes to our prevention curricula. Absolutely. Like those things did happen. But the amount of labor that it took to make such incremental changes, it was too much in terms of it being coupled with all the other things, right? In terms of what's in my toolbox in leaving Princeton, Princeton's not the first institution that I've, had to navigate that's incredibly old, incredibly white, white lead, and just has problematic, American roots. So, but in terms of what's in my toolbox, I definitely have, the experience of working with um, a true diverse population of students from all kinds of walks of life around the globe. I've had to navigate, I've had to learn how to navigate um, a really old institution that presents itself as pretty progressive and invested in um, substantive social change on the surface. Um, and I did so um, in a way in which I was able to grow professionally. Right, I learned how to find loopholes to get what I needed. Right, I asked for a promotion. I'm told no. I go get 2 counter offers. I get my promotion. Right, I learned how to navigate that kind of employment space. I learned the kinds of things that matter to those institutions, which requires a lot of translation and filtering for me because it's not necessarily parallel with my own, you know, working philosophies and the way I live my life. Um, and I feel like in leaving Princeton, um, I can do that a little bit better, a little bit quicker.
So, in its best case scenario, you've talked about, this idea that a person who there's a power level here
Mm-hmm.
engaged in it. So, to be most effective, you would need to be someone who could make decisions or be at a certain level of power in an institution, right?
Mm-hmm.
You sort of identified this idea of me needing to circumvent certain hard pieces of that institution, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we were going to walk away and we were going to say to ourselves, what is the best DEI situation? In your mind, what then would that look like? Given all that you said, you've had to learn how to, get 2 offers in order to get the job that you needed, even though you've got the paper like the other dude to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the best scenario? How are we really going to be as successful as we can in order to make this proposition work within institutions that, as you say, define themselves as progressive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is a really hard question to answer. If I knew the answer to that question, I think I would still be there working that out. That's my honest answer. I do believe that decision-making power is important, but what I end up finding, though, is, and this is, I'm making these grandiose statements, and I don't really mean them to be that way. So I'm speaking generally, but in my observations, many times, when someone with multiple or one marginalized identity or experience rises to a level of power, they have to end up making a lot of compromises. I mean, I certainly experienced harm from a Black cisgender woman in leadership who was coming for me, right? And so wanted to silence me. And so it's hard to sort of figure that out when these institutions by design were not built for us. it's really hard to imagine this best case scenario for DEI. Best case scenario, we wouldn't need DEI, right? We would have DEI, and we would be able to be a healthier people. Um, but that's not the reality. And so if I'm thinking like pragmatically, what it looks like is similar to what I and some of my other colleagues at Princeton and otherwise do. We enter an institution, we try to make the changes that we can, and then we move on. And we leave work for new folks to build and grow it, right? And we hope that, the changes we made are lasting and meaningful and helpful, and that we've trained enough people before we leave to be able to pick up the pieces and continue to work. But that's what I can only really think of right now in this moment pragmatically about what that best case scenario is. Because ideally we wouldn't, this would be, this is a field where we're trying to work ourselves out of a job.
Right.
And so that's the best case scenario for me.
Can anybody do DEI work? Like, does it have to be a Black person? Does it have to be a Black person?
Absolutely not.
Do DEI work?
Yeah, no. And just being Black or brown doesn't mean you can do it either. You've got to really be a person who can be internally reflexive and humble. And when someone calls you out on your shit, you take that, you swallow that gift, and you work on yourself so that you don't do it again. Right? That's just one example of what's required. And so often in DEI work, in social work, in helping professions, there are folks there that don't do that. And there's a number of different reasons for that. We don't necessarily have to get into like the why that happens, but that's real. I have been led by many, supervisors who were not able to be reflexive. It was a lot of external pointing out in terms of where the problems were or who the problem people were or the problematic actions. There wasn't a lot of internal work, right? I mean, for me personally, I had to do that at Princeton. There was, student protests while I was there, and some of the students that I worked closely with participated in that protest, and they never came to me. They protested my office, and I was just like, at first, I was surprised, I was shocked, I was upset, I felt a little betrayed, and then I had to check myself. I am employed by the institution they feel is causing harm, so I am complicit in my employment. And so how dare I, expect that my students would come to me if they felt that harm was happening because of my office, right? That kind of thought process does not happen regularly. Like when I was at Princeton, I was in therapy, right? I was a Black woman in therapy who was talking to my therapist about my professional woes because I didn't want to bring that crap into the spaces where I'm supposed to be supporting students, right? And so that's important work. You got to be able to take all of that stuff and process it somewhere so that you reduce the likelihood of you causing more harm. And then you have to be equipped enough to know that when you do cause harm, because mistakes and missteps, they happen, you've got to learn how to repair, restore, acknowledge, and learn. It's not just doing a presentation and defining equity for the new incoming class of students.
I appreciate that. That's a really powerful thing you just said. I'm going to open up a little bit for questions from the audience. Audience, do you have questions?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
And maybe An odd question. But the people protesting, were they white or were they black?
I didn't hear that.
I mean, he wanted to know the people who were protesting your office at the time, were they white or black? What was the?
Oh, they were a diverse pool of students.
Yeah.
How much pushback did they get from white students?
From
white students.
how much did her office get?
Yeah.
So the question was, how much did your office get pushback from white students for the?
During the protest?
Yeah.
You know, it's really hard to identify where the rationale for the protest, like who were, let me say it this way. It's hard to identify what group of students by their racial identities came up with their rationale for the protest. What we were privy to at that time were like a list of demands. They had a collective website where, you know, a whole bunch of folks could come in and populate statements, concerns. And so you can't really piece that apart. One of the concerns, though, was that we were a white office, which, you know, personally, right, as a Black staff member, I was like, that makes me feel invisible. But then I had to check myself again, like, this is not about you, Avina. This is about the students and what their experience is, right? And so when I was able to do that, I was able to think, oh, they're not talking about the individual bodies in the office. They're talking about the way in which the office conducts itself. Mm-hmm. And if I were to think about that, which I did, it would be very easy for me to come up with a similar conclusion, that it operates like a white space. It is a white space. We were housed in an infirmary. We were a clinical office housed within an infirmary, mm-hmm. And led by a white cisgender female director, right? So, yes. So so there were concerns around how the office conducted itself, right? Both with clients and with other offices on campus, which caused an uproar in our office. And we had to have some real hard, honest, vulnerable conversations about what we do and how we can do better. Mm-hmm. And that was not always easily received, right? By the team, myself included.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like, you know, you're in Virginia, I'm in Virginia. We can talk a little bit about the politics of the place, because as I said, you know, what happened here in 2017 in Charlottesville seemed to cause this community to address its inequities in a very deliberate way, whether it be comfortable or not, right? Mm-hmm. But even in that process, there was a whole lot of talk about, can we get back to normal? Can we go back to the way things were? And as we now sit a year or more into our Republican governor, and he is defining for us what normalcy looks like, and normalcy looks like, you know, whatever makes people any form uncomfortable, that's not going to happen in Virginia. And so for many of us who thought we were in fact moving towards more, you know, to the forefront of progressiveness, you know, we, you know, ratified ERA, we, you know, we're the state that still has abortion rights here, you know, all of those kinds of things. So there was that clear legislative progressivism, which now some of us feel like, okay, time's up. You know, we may very well no longer have to engage in DEI in institutions as a box check, right? Mm-hmm. We may have to, as we were talking earlier, become even more grassroots than we were, because it's not like you walk into your DII office and you got the lush couches and they hooked you up and, you know, you've got all your culturally responsive murals and photos and whatever. You're bringing all that stuff from home and putting it all together in your office, right? They're not bringing that in for you.
Right.
So I'm thinking about now the future of this practice. And I'm thinking about even as we watch, what happened to the federal government and the more and more moving towards a kind of conservative position that lets people off the hook in some way. They don't have to do this stuff anymore. Mm-hmm. Right? What's the work? And how do we as believers continue to do the work in your mind?
It just makes me think that the work doesn't stop. The methodology changes, right? So when I was working for the state, and there was this move, right, to remove the word equity from the names of offices, departments, positions, and whatnot. It doesn't mean that the equity work stops. Unfortunately, though, what I see or what I imagine that's going to happen is that becomes additional labor that people do that's uncompensated because they're invested in the change. And so you may not have, a DEI committee, for example, but it doesn't mean that there aren't a group or you don't have a collective of folks getting together trying to strategize what they can do from their own positions and their own seats of power. That's the work. It's to also equip and teach young folks about the work. And that's why some of, the disciplines that haven't really been as explicitly attacked, like sociology, for example, becomes really critical, right? Because you are teaching folks how to think analytically for themselves. That's not something that I got in public education, in high school, middle school. That kind of stuff happened at home, which is the other piece, is that we're equipping ourselves within our family units, within our friendships, right? I've got a standard in my friendships, right? Like, you've got to be invested in this work. I need to know where you're going to be if the revolution comes, right? I've got to be able to count on you if you're going to be in my friend circle. So that's where, the work happens. DEI work happened long before there were paid positions for it, or grants or proposals developed for it. That's part of our legacy as a people, and we continue that.
All right, I'm gonna open it up one more time to the audience. If there are questions, please let us know. I've got one last question that I'm gonna hold for because you and I could have this conversation all day and all night.
We could. I believe you.
Go ahead.
I'm curious about what wellness looks like for you now and going forward, and an invitation for how we sustain, and how specifically you as a woman of color are sustaining wellness, because there's days where people can just want to pull their covers over your head.
Yeah. I recognize that, in where I am professionally, in my career, I have a lot of privilege. I work from home. I have family nearby. I have friends who understand the work that I do that I can really just unpack with. So I'm privileged and I'm blessed in that capacity. But when I have those bad days, what does well-being look like? It looks like me shutting off the laptop and walking away. But that's not something that everybody has the privilege of doing, right? I am pretty stern about my personal time. And these are practices, right, that I didn't always do. I was definitely a big time worker bee. I worked when I wasn't getting paid. I did all of those kinds of things because I thought those were the dues, right, that I had to pay to get to where I wanted to be professionally. But I don't do those things anymore. And the biggest piece of practice that I really feel like elevates my well-being is to say no. And, as a Black woman, even outside of the professional realm, the practice of saying no is not something that we holistically embrace all the time because, I'm a caregiver. And the thought of telling someone who needs my care no for that moment or that day or that week feels selfish, right? It feels wrong. But through a lot of therapy, I have learned to ask myself, what is it that Avina needs in this moment? And to prioritize that. And I do, I do. My son sees me do it. He's like, mommy needs her moment. Like, he recognizes it. He values it. I model it for him, and now he does it. And so those are the kinds of like day-to-day kind of practices that I do to really just elevate my well-being and to try at least once a day to be able to pinpoint where I've had joy. And if I haven't, to work that much harder the next day to have a moment of joy.
That's good advice. And yes, we do have a question. It goes back to the conversation about Princeton. Mm-hmm. And the question was, what made you think that Princeton was sincere in wanting to fully develop and implement a DEI institution?
I never really thought that they were sincere. I didn't think that they were sincere. I'll be honest. At that time in my life, when I, accepted my offer with Princeton, I had just, earned my PhD, and the job market was incredibly scarce. My field is very tiny. We tend to all know each other, especially in Virginia, and so there weren't a lot of opportunities for me. What really, I think, swayed me in terms of accepting the job offer, uprooting my family to New Jersey, was the prospect of professional development for me. I needed a space where I could learn and grow as a leader and as a supervisor. My supervisor and I aligned. Even though we had our challenges, we did align in terms of many of the approaches that I advocated for on behalf of domestic and sexual violence prevention work. And, lastly, it was enough of a financial offer for me to be able to take care of my family in a brand new way. And, everyone knows about Princeton's endowment, the size of it. And, they do pay their staff decently. Doesn't mean it's equitable. I can go on record as saying that. But it definitely moved us into a new phase of growth in my family. And so it was a decision that I had to make on behalf of my family as a provider.
Yeah, we're all there in that first job. After you finish that PhD and you look behind you and those bills are still sitting on the table, you're like,
they are.
I can make this work. I'm armed and ready for this. Well, Avina, thank you so very much for talking with us tonight. We greatly appreciate your insights on our journey to better understand this space of DEI. And for everyone who's out there with us, thank you for joining us at our another Evelyn Barbour series. Hope to see you on Saturday for the reparations run. If you haven't signed up, sign up. We're giving money earned or raised to 8 other African American led nonprofit. So we hope you're with us, and we'll see you there on Saturday. And again, Avina, thank you so much. Good talking to you.
You too. Y'all have a good night. Take good care of yourselves and each other.